My name is Margie Dohorst, and I'm a consulting teacher, curriculum instruction designer part-time for the Center for Responsive Schools. My background in education is as many years as an educator. I spent about half of them as an elementary principal. So a lot of my passion for the work that I'm sharing with you today comes from those 16 years as an elementary principal, and also being in a school that implemented responsive classroom as a school-wide approach about 20 years ago. I'm in Wisconsin, so I'm central Wisconsin, kind of a rural area, which does mean we have rural internet. So hopefully my 15 whatever speed that I'm at gets to all of you and doesn't pause. But if it does, just know as I'm pausing or slowing down in my speech, I'll be coming back because that's how internet works out here. I'm gonna unshare for just a minute, but I want to show you the Zoom tools that we have. But before I do that, this is a leadership webinar. And if you're joining in and saying, well, is this leadership webinar for me? Leaders in schools take many forms. Leaders are the administrators, the teacher leaders. Sometimes it's even parents that we see as leaders working in our schools. They may be in the school or they may be in another setting. Many times our coaches, our support staff, our student support folks are our leaders. So this is for you. And the purpose today is to talk about the power of our words, a very powerful resource that we talk about, Responsive Classroom, and how it helps us impact the work that we do with adults. So take a minute right now. I want you to think about the goals of this webinar. This webinar is designed for you. We know the importance of leaders in the roles that we have as well. So think about these roles, and as I explain these goals today of the webinar, connect with how these goals connect with you in the role that you have. So first of all, this is a time where we're going to take a deep dive into the responsive classroom principles, strategies, and practices that will help you enhance the work that you're doing with staff right now, but also that will help you with looking further ahead. So you're going to be looking at practices that you can use right now when we're in the remote school place, but also practices that you can use as you move ahead, possibly to in school in the fall, or again, it's kind of an unknown. When we're leading adults through this global crisis that we're in right now, I know it's been a challenge. And even though I say that you might be in a role where you're doing remote leadership, I think that the work that you're doing right now is even more vital. So being a remote leader is really what's keeping the work that you're doing successful for people, helping people see strengths that they didn't even know they have, and helping them work through the challenges that they have right now. The main practice that we're going to focus on for that first goal today that we're talking about is the practice of positive teacher language. The second goal is to focus on enhancing leadership skills. So as we work on using approaches that are designed in the responsive classroom approach for us to use as we work with students, I'm going to fashion them in a way today to help you really consider how you'd use these same practices to support your role as a leader. And the third one is, our goal is to have some time to stop, to reflect. I'm going to have pauses in this webinar today, so you'll have time to think and reflect and jot down your thoughts, but also to give you time to connect with other leaders, with other peers. And we'll do that through the breakout room. I was reading this a little excerpt about Wayne Gretzky the other day, and I thought about the quote that gets requoted a lot of time with him. And it made me think about the situation we're in right now with the remote learning that we've all been thrown into. And he said, I skate where the puck is going, not where it's been. And as we think about these leadership skills right now, we're kind of just skating. And sometimes it doesn't even feel like we're staying on the ice or staying upright. But we're the leaders. We're the leaders that are helping us get where we're going. Take a minute right now to reflect on these goals and think about what you're hoping, or where you're going, where your puck is going, and what you're hoping to take away from today's webinar that you can use right away with the staff that you work with. And also think about if it's more, you think about the future, like what next you're going to get. On your piece of paper, if you haven't grabbed one yet, grab a piece of paper and something to jot down. Jot down a goal. What is your goal for you for the webinar today? I'll give you about 30 seconds to jot down that goal. To support our work in the responsive classroom, our group guidelines help us achieve those goals that we've set. So I'm just going to briefly go through them, but I want you to visualize how these guidelines will help you with the work that you're doing today as well. So first of all, take care of your learning and personal needs. We're all in our homes, most likely. There might be times when you need to step away or take care of a need of a family member or something like that. Feel free to do that, like I said before, and you can stop video and come back when you can. To respect and support others, the challenge of any type of Zoom presentation is a challenge of trying to be present. So do what you can to help you to be present in the content today, but also take care of what you need. The challenge where it becomes that it's helpful to respect and support others is when we get into those breakout rooms. So when you're in a breakout room, there'll be 2 different breakout rooms that I'll be using. Couple ways to help respect and support others. For one thing, I'll help support you by giving you the question or discussion that you're going to be talking about twice so that you either hear it twice or hear it and see it before you go into the breakout. When you get into the breakout, I will also be giving a direction as to who will be the first person to share in what order that you'll share. And the third thing that I'm going to ask you to do is do a quick introduction of yourself to the other people that are in the group. I kind of call it that cocktail party introduction. Hello, my name is Margie. I'm a consulting teacher for Responsive Classroom. I live in Wisconsin. And then also in the breakout room, that's a time where you can unmute so that you can be heard and have more of a natural kind of conversation. When you do get into a breakout room, sometimes we have people in the breakout rooms that prefer to stay in the main group and just want their own time for personal reflection. If you don't join the breakout room, or if you get to a breakout room where others aren't present, you can just rejoin the large group. And that becomes part of a time where you can do more reflection or do some chatting with others. And finally, take care of your learning materials and space. Well, that's kind of funny because you're in your space, but also many times people get frustrated because they can't have the PowerPoint or the notes in any type of presentation. This will be provided for you as a recorded copy, but also since you are in your homes, take time to jot down notes in any way that'll be helpful for you. And also know that I will be sharing with you the resources that we're using, but just so that you know, so you don't have to have that in your head the whole time. The main resource I'm using is the book, The Power of Our Words by Paula Denton. And then also the accompanying book for middle school, The Power of Our Words. So if you have those resources nearby, just know that that's what I'll be referencing. You don't need the books for this workshop. And the last one I'm going to say is challenge by choice. That if you're more comfortable watching and listening versus being a participant, we'd love you to get that feeling of being a participant. We're just glad you took 90 minutes of your valuable time to be here. And I'm excited that in this challenging time, we can still reach so many of you through a webinar. Take about 20 seconds right now to reflect on these group guidelines. How will following these guidelines help you to be a successful participant today in this webinar, but also to help you reflect on and consider how you might reach your goals today? Guidelines are powerful for our work in schools and our connection with our workshops that we do in Responsive Classroom, but I find that they're also really very proactive, even in a Zoom format. I find that they're really helpful. So we're going to take our journey today and know that our goal is to talk about positive teacher language and how it supports our work. But we're going to start with the heart of our work, which is the core belief and the guiding principles of Responsive Classroom. Many of you that are joining us today are very familiar with Responsive Classroom. I'm assuming that there's some people that joined in because this is work that you're already participating in your school. Many of you, this might be your journey into the work that we're doing in Responsive Classroom, and you're all welcome here. There's a place for all of you. The core beliefs and the guiding principles of Responsive Classroom are the heart of the work. They're close to 40 years ago when this approach started. It's the guiding principles and the core belief that have been the true north of all the work that we've done with students. Now I want you to think today, we're going to take these same core beliefs and guiding principles, and we're going to frame them in a way that if we take these same ideas and think about the unique role that the educators and the teachers that we work with right now. And I'm first going to say, I'm going to use the word teachers inclusively. So when I'm talking about teachers in the school personnel group, in our school family is what I would call them. Every adult that works in that school is teaching children. So when I say teachers, I mean the office staff, the support staff, the coaches, the custodial staff, special education, the interventionists, the specialist. Every person is a teacher. I had this little bit of aha while I was planning this webinar. I was thinking, in the role of school personnel, we don't do teaching, we are teachers. And every person is impacted right now by, I almost want to call it Hurricane COVID, because it feels like it's this slow change of how we're doing things right now. Although it's a storm many of us maybe haven't seen outside our windows, but yet we've boxed up the schools and we've closed down the schools, and we feel this sense of impending, unpredictable change, and we don't know when it's going to end. The other thing we realize, school isn't the only thing in this impending global crisis that has been impacted. Our students are home learning remotely, but home for all of our students and the teachers that support them are all changed. Maybe people are working from home. Maybe they're essential workers and they're out working and trying to manage a remote education for their children at the same time while they're trying to meet the needs of the people that are out there. Maybe it's a family in crisis. We don't know. And at the same time, as teachers, we are responsible for supporting our students in having the best education they can during this impending crisis. So as you can kind of get that sense right now, there's a sense among the educators that you're working with that they have a sense of stress, worry, empathy, frustration, and maybe have their own crises that they're dealing with. So how do we as leaders support them? I'm going to have you read the core belief in two ways. The first time, read the belief and think about students and how those words impact your work with students. Then read it a second time and now change it up. How do those words impact your work with the adults that you work with? Take a minute to read the core belief. When we look at this core belief in our belief as working with students, we see that those competencies in the responsive classroom approach, social emotional competencies and academic competencies, are absolutely essential to the work that we do with students. And they're also essential to the teachers that work with our students. And right now, when we work with all of the adults and the teachers that we work with remotely, it's a challenge to make sure that we're supporting all those competencies with the teachers and also with the students. We're going to dig into these competencies a little bit more, and I'm going to pull out different pieces of these today for you to think about. Below are the guiding principles. So in the responsive classroom approach, there are 6 guiding principles that guide the work of all of the adults to achieve that core belief, to work on this approach toward being successful with students. We talk about those guiding beliefs as helping us, or guiding principles to get us to that true north. Take a minute to read those guiding principles, and then I'm going to pull out one of them that we're going to work a little bit more deeply with today. So as you can see by looking at these guiding principles, our work is focusing on supporting students to be successful socially, emotionally, and academically. And we do that by teaching them in a variety of ways, in a way that involves that connection with other students through social interaction, and also by a strong sense of knowing students and families. The one that I'm going to pull out today is the fourth guiding principle. And I read this out loud to you as you think of words that just stand out to you in this guiding principle in the time that you're working with students right now and with staff. How we work together as adults to create a safe, joyful, and inclusive school environment is as important as our individual contribution or competence. How the group, the adult family, the teachers that all work together in your school work together is important. And it's so important, it stands as the fourth guiding principle in the work that we do. When we think about that positive school community when we're in the school building, it becomes the work of everybody. And although leaders take on a lot of that role to ensure that we have a positive adult community, it is an everybody role that we have. Now, when educators are working from their homes and they aren't in that school building together, it even becomes more important to have a sense of connectiveness. And there's probably many things you're doing to try to provide that. On your piece of paper right now, underneath that goal that you wrote, take 30 seconds to jot down some words that describe the characteristics of a positive adult school community. What are the characteristics in your view, in your vision, of a positive adult school community? Jot those down. When we entered into this hurricane COVID preparation, well, it's almost 2 months ago now. And one of the things we realized is that the longer we're in this work, it's become more and more clear that the school is the heart of the community. And schools are in the middle of small communities, large communities, urban communities, but they truly are the heart. And what we realize is that not only do schools provide an education, but they literally inspire and mold the future with our most precious resource, our children. And the people that make the difference in that world are those teachers. And again, teachers inclusively. Every adult that works in a school are teaching our children. Here's that core belief again. And I'm going to go through the competencies a little bit more in detail, but I'm going to really focus today on the academic competencies as they impact adults. So today our work is really going to be focusing on those social-emotional competencies and academic competencies that we can support with adults, and know that it's the adults, the teachers in our school community, that are the road to using these same competencies with their students. If we think about the challenges that teachers are put in front of them every day, but especially now in remote learning, think about the time when they need those social emotional competencies, that ability to have cooperation, to work with others, to work with parents, maybe the tech person, to work through an issue and collaboratively solve a problem. They have that sense of needing assertiveness, an ability to make their needs known in a positive way, to make their opinions and their thoughts respectively responded to others. A lot of responsibility. It's interesting, as I was talking to a teacher yesterday, she was saying the amount of responsibility and the sense of responsibility she has as a remote teacher has been incredible. She said, it's 25 times the amount of responsibility I had as an in-person teacher. And I never seem to be able to turn it off. I always feel responsible. There's that sense of empathy. And I have to say, while we're working with students in their homes through remote learning, perhaps dropping off or delivering or getting things back from families, it really has opened up our eyes as educators to the reality of each of our children's lives outside of those school hours. And that understanding and responding respectfully to the ability to be able to connect with our students has been huge. If we didn't show that empathy with our families and students, we wouldn't be able to connect with them in that positive way. And self-control. Part of self-control, I have to say, is supporting your teachers to turn off the technology. When your classroom is your kitchen, you have to be able to close down the classroom and be a family member. So helping to build those boundaries. Some of these are really strong competencies that adults have when they bring to our work, and some of them literally are ones that need extra support and struggle. Truthfully, that's the same thing that happens with students. Some of these are really strong with our students, and some of them are a struggle. The difference in the responsive classroom approach, both as a leader for adults and as a teacher for students, is we feel like these competencies are so important that not only do we know that they're needed for students to be success, we know it's our responsibility to teach them. With adults, that teaching of those social emotional competencies isn't as direct as it is with students. That would feel demeaning or insulting possibly. But what we can do it is through our supportive, positive teacher language. And that's what you're going to learn about today. Now, I said I'm going to highlight the academic competencies. If you were in the webinar last week, you know we spent the whole webinar pretty much talking about social emotional competencies with students. But with the academic competencies, this has been, I think, a place where it's really kind of brought to mind the remote learning challenges. First of all, an academic competency of an academic mindset is that ability where you see yourself belonging and having success in that school setting. Now put adults in that. I belong and I see myself as having success in this remote school format. Many people nobody had a choice. You were thrown into this. You were under contract. You were said, here, this is how you're going to be teaching now. And we did the best we could to support them. But there were some people when the doors were closed and you're going to remote learning, probably said, I can do this. I know I can do this. I do a lot of technology. I'm excited about the change. And some people might have said, this is not for me. I did not get into education for this. I don't even know, what RAM is or how to do a Zoom meeting. This isn't for me. We can't be successful in anything that we do unless we can have an academic mindset that sees ourselves being successful in that setting. That, again, is where our positive teacher language comes in. We help those teachers be successful by helping them see the potential that they have. Perseverance. Boy, this has taken a lot of perseverance. And for some of us, perseverance is our superpower. And for some of us, it can be a challenge. As leaders, you know that challenge that perseverance can have, but we can get through anything if we can do it together. And I think that's part of the challenge right now. If I was in a school setting and I had a problem with technology, I know right who to go to get some help with technology. Now I'm in my kitchen doing my workshop, and who do I get help from? Sometimes you have to persevere to get that help, to be assertive, to get the support that you need. Learning strategies, that can be a real challenge when it comes to remote learning. You may have had everything laid out to do well in your classroom, and now you have to figure out how to deliver that remotely. You may not have the same skills that another educator has to attack that learning, to pull out the most important areas. That's, again, where we can help our teachers with having those learning strategies. And I'm saying we, but we is we. We doesn't mean necessarily has to be you. It's definitely a team of leaders that support our educators. And the last one, academic behaviors. We get the school behaviors down pretty well. Get to work on time, maybe start with our coffee, visit with people. No, we have our routines. It's been thrown for a loop with remote learning. It's been thrown for a loop not only with remote learning because it's remote, but also because you're in your home. You might have other things going on at the same time in your home. Your children might be doing remote learning. Your spouse or significant others might be on a computer right next to you. So there's been some changes in the ability to, what is on time? What are the schedules? What are the amounts that you're going to do? All of those behaviors and competencies that I'm thinking many teachers felt successful with in the school setting are now being challenged in the remote setting. I'm going to pause for a minute and have you reflect on these competencies, the social, emotional, and the academic competencies. Jot down one or two examples on your paper about how these competencies are currently showing up in your leadership in supporting the teachers that you work with. As we move into our work today in the practice of teacher language, Responsive Classroom has a number of proven practices that are well used in schools around the world. One of the most important practices that we teach, one of the most powerful practices we teach, is the strategy of positive teacher language. This is a quote from the book, The Power of Our Words. Take a minute to read this again and read this 2 times again. Read it first with the power of our words for students, and then the power of our words as we impact the teachers that we work with from 2 viewpoints. Paula Denton, in her book, The Power of Our Words, helps bring this practice of positive teacher language to light in such a powerful way. The practice of positive teacher language truly, I feel like, is one of the important keys for building a foundation of change and growth in support. And how it does that is it really it lays that foundation of trust. When students feel that sense of connectiveness and trust with their teachers, learning can happen. Challenge can take place. Risks happen. But exactly the same thing happens with our language with the adults that we work with. While I talk about the work today of how we're supporting teachers with the power of our words, in addition to that, I also want you to think about how your modeling of this positive teacher language is also supporting teachers in using the same type of language and the similar practices with the students and the families that they work with. To help us get started with our work today, you're going to use an interactive learning structure called a circle map. So get that paper and pen or pencil out again. And in the middle of your paper, make a circle. You make a big circle, little circle, however you do it. And in the middle of that circle, write the words positive teacher language. With this circle map, so on this piece of paper, you're going to jot down words or thoughts that stand out to you from the content that I'm going to be sharing with you. I'm going to be presenting content to you about the power of positive teacher language. And then after we take that information together, you're going to share in an interactive learning structure to share the parts that stand out to you. And I want you to decide what is the lens that you're going to look at this content from. Maybe you're really focused on the teachers that you work with that are in front of you right now, the ones in the remote learning. And maybe because it's May and you're seeing that the school year is possibly coming to an end where you might be thinking of the fall. And again, not knowing if we'll be remote school or in person at that time. Use the lens that works the best for you today, that helps make this information the most meaningful. So what is the impact that teacher language has on a positive community? These are 3 characteristics of what positive teacher language does. And I'm going to frame these up in the frame that we have right now as presenters and leaders with our teaching staff. First of all, language molds our sense of who we are. If you think back to adults that you interacted with, maybe in your role as a teacher or leader, or maybe it was something when you were a student, words that stuck with you at some point helped mold that sense of who you were. We do this by noticing positive characteristics. We might even be pulling out things with our adults that they may not even realize were a talent. Somebody pulled out something one time from me that said that I was empathetic. And I had to really think about that. I thought, I must present a way that shows people that I really understand their feelings. And it kind of became my superpower. That once I had this sense of me, like, yeah, I guess I am. I really do get in touch with people's feelings. I now view myself as a person who's empathetic. Second one, language helps us understand ourselves. You know how when you want to see what you look like, you can look in the mirror and get a reflection back, and you might correct a little bit here or there. Our language helps us get a better understanding of ourselves when it's reflected back to us. Do you ever watch some of those counseling videos, and maybe you've been a participant of a counselor session or a therapist session, where literally the purpose of the therapist is to repeat back what you said? Like, oh yeah, yes, I am sad about that today. That is not what this is about. But what we can do is use our positive teacher language to reflect back by describing an action. And it helps us clarify our intent at times, help us understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. And finally, language influences the nature of our relationships. There's a quote that stood out to me, I think it was Stephen Covey, was it? Relationships, relationships, relationships. There's no significant learning without significant relationships. And when we think about how those relationships develop and grow, it's really through that language, that sense of trust that we receive from people. There was a quote about the power of language that stuck with me. And it stuck with me. I realized that it's now been over 20 years. The quote was from a person I worked with named Linda Crawford. And she said, "Teacher language is the air the children breathe and the water the children swim in." And I think about that with our language, even with adults. Our language is the air the adults breathe and the water the adults swim in. Don't you want clear, positive, pure air and water versus the opposite? Well, one of the challenges right now with our ability to lead with our language, with our adult community, is we're in this remote learning situation. So we're going to talk about that today and the criticalness of our role as we do this as well. But I'm going to reiterate this because I think this is so important. Positive teacher language is one of the most powerful strategies that we have to build and to strengthen a positive school community. So let's learn more about it. And again, you can add to your circle map. In the work of Paula Denton, in our training that we do with Responsive Classroom, we talk about these 5 general guidelines of teacher language. I'm going to frame them up today as examples of things that we do when we work with the adults that we serve and that we work with, the teachers. So one characteristic of positive teacher language is it's direct and genuine. The quote that we often say is, "Say what you mean and mean what you say." Adults have a way of using indirect or maybe sarcastic comments in order to communicate at times. Sometimes I think we feel like it'll fall easier when we say it with a joke. We also are communicating with adults right now without the ability to have that in-person connection. I looked this quote up last night because I wanted to be sure what it is, and listen to this. 93% of communication is nonverbal. 93% of communication is through our tone, the visual, the body language, and 7% is verbal. Think about how you're communicating with the adults that you work with right now. How much of it's through a text, an email, And even if it's remote, you're still missing part of that connection. You might have observed something and send a message that said, sure was nice you had so many students today. Ha ha. Maybe you observed and joined in a Zoom meeting and they had 7 students. You don't know if those 7 students were, a group that maybe there was a reason it was a small group today. Or maybe that teacher reached out and had 1 new student in there that they hadn't had before. But what we put in text stays. And how it's interpreted is based on those words and inferences they make. So when we're direct and genuine, remove the sarcasm, be direct, and if you want an action to take place, state that action. Don't infer it. The second characteristic is convey faith. Quality leader that I work with, I talked with over the weekend, she says, I assume positive intentions. Right now, it's easy based on how we're as leaders observing what teachers doing is looking at content. Maybe we're looking at a log or looking at lesson plans or looking at some possible samples of what's done. And sometimes we make assumptions that possibly things aren't being done to the level that you had set up an expectation for, or there's dates missing or things like that. If we can assume positive intentions, that as we communicate and look at that, have faith that they're doing the best they can, and everybody's best is going to be different. When we approach with that sense, we continue to maintain that trust and relationship. The third characteristic, focus on action versus character. We know that when we're using language, our language is so powerful. And I said how it kind of helps you make a sense of who you are. The sense of who you are needs to be what you hear from that description of your actions. So for example, maybe you observed a class that was going on and you said, I saw you use a visual cue to silently remind students to mute. You focused on the action. You gave a description of what they did. Versus maybe a characteristic or a generalization. You're a genius. Might have been a very smart thing that they had done, but it might have been someone else's idea that they stole. And they might think, well, I wasn't a genius. It really was another person. Another idea. I heard you say that you understood the challenge you're going through to a student, maybe to a parent, versus saying, you're so caring. By saying you're so caring, you're not really helping the teacher get the identity of what they did that gave that sense of making that connection. Fourth characteristic, keep it brief. Less is more when it comes to words that we use for directions. Even when we're saying something positive, when we over-articulate something positive, it loses its meaning. And if we're giving a correction, keep that simple. And finally, know when to be silent. The digital formats, first of all, make this even more important. There can be a delay, or processing because we're only getting part of the message through not receiving all of the nonverbals can take longer. And when you give time or direction to support a teacher, stop and let those words sink in and let them have time to respond. When we use these guidelines for positive teacher language, we communicate a lot, even in that little bit of verbal language that we can do. But in the challenges that they're going through right now and the needs that they have, through positive teacher language, we're giving them reassurance, encouragement, affirmation, and support. Jot down your last ideas in your circle map as we get ready to enter into our first breakout room. As I prepare your breakout room, you're going to go into a group with, ideally, it'll be about 5 or 6 other leaders that'll be in that group. When you get into the group, the first thing you're going to do, I'm going to put it back over here. The first thing you're going to do is share your name, do that brief introduction. Hi, my name is Margie, and where you're from and your role. And then you're going to share one thing that you've added to your circle map. When you do that, just share briefly. Don't get into a lot of detail into the, just share briefly. I added convey faith. And you might say why, but just make it like a 1-sentence share. After everybody gets a chance to share in their circle map, then have some time to discuss. Now, what happens when you get to breakout rooms is you get sent rather quickly. So it's kind of like you're sent to a breakout room, and it's kind of like the Star Trek Beam Me Up Scotty. So you're getting sent to a breakout room. You'll see other people come in. You have to accept. Once everyone's in the breakout room, one of the challenges of breakout rooms is deciding who gets to go first. I'm going to have you, because everybody's name is present, share in the order of your first names alphabetically. So as you share, you're going to pick the person, probably if you're an Angela or an Angela or an Angie or whatever, you might be one of the first people that gets to go first. And then just go in order alphabetically. And as you do that, look at your circle map. Maybe someone's sharing something that you've already shared. Or perhaps you're adding something you hadn't thought of. As you enter into that time of sharing, get an idea of how the power of this teacher language is something you can use right now to support your educators. Whoops. Looks like I totally just got out of my sharing. All right, hopefully you're all there. Hello. And I'm going to put you into rooms in just a minute. So hopefully you're ready with your notes and your circle map. And you'll be ready to beam up. Now, one last thing. If you get into your group and for some reason people have backed out of the group, what you'll do is if there's no one else in the group, is just leave the group and come back to the main area. That'll give you some time to either do some reflecting, or if there's a group of us, we'll do some chatting. So I think we have, everybody back. And hopefully that power of getting to connect with other educators has been helpful for you to see that power of our teacher language. In the last part of the webinar today, we're going to talk about some specifics. So as we move into those next areas, you're going to have more time to do some reflecting on your specific role that you have in the school. And just hearing from a couple of people that stayed back with us, there were some thoughts about just how our language can impact every person that we work with. One of the most powerful teacher language that we can use is called reinforcing language. We talk about reinforcing language with students, but I'm going to highlight how we can use this when we work with adults as well. Reinforcing language names concrete and specific behaviors. We often are labeling what we observe. Sometimes we have like little cheat sheets of words that help us to know how we're going to state those observations. Sometimes we'll say, I see, or I saw. I see that you had everybody raise their hand, even if they were in remote learning to practice their school behaviors. I heard you ask for students to take time to think. I notice. And sometimes those statements start with the word you. You did this. Again, it's highlighting what you see and observe and notice. We use reinforcing language generously. It applies to all. But let me clarify this. If we're talking to an individual, that reinforcing language is for the individual. It's often given privately. It's not meant to pull out one person as a sample for other people. I say that now as we talk about adults, which we wouldn't imagine ever doing, but we do that a lot with students. Oh, I like the way that Sally's raising her hand. Not to really reinforce Sally, but to support the rest of you to raise your hand. We would never do that with adults. But when we do talk with adults, we don't want to pull an adult out individually as well, but be generous in that reinforcing language for individuals. And when we're applying it to all, we can use language that's inclusive. So if it's an example that I might be putting out in an email to staff, I notice lesson plans are including a variety of ways to engage students in remote learning. So I make an inclusive statement for all. I'm careful not to say, I notice most of you are using lesson plans that include that. And I'll tell you why. Because if I say that, I'm always assuming I'm not in the most. And it's dividing my group. I want to use inclusive language. Reinforcing language emphasizes description over personal approval. Again, we want to be careful about I like or I love. Oh, I love that lesson that you did. Well, if you love that lesson, what was it about it that I did great that you loved? And it's not about pleasing you. It's about having adults do the thinking and reflecting about what is working for them. That they're doing the thinking, not for us as leaders to make us happy, but to do what's best for them. It also, oh, I wrote down an example so I can remember to say this. So yeah, I wrote, I like the way, or I love the way. This is important too, when you're emphasizing a description, be genuine in what you're observing. Be genuine in your description. Teachers can know when we're just pulling something out of our hat. You need to be real, and that builds the trust. Reinforcing language can reflect important goals and values. Here's an example. I heard you mention the SEL skill of empathy in the activity that you did today. Our goal, to focus on those social emotional learning goals. I heard you mention the social emotional goal of empathy in your activity today. So it reflects that important goal. And finally, I think this last one is really important too. We point out approximations toward mastery. An analogy somebody gave to me about this is when you're watching a baby walk for the first time, you don't say yay when they finally can walk back and forth across the room 3 times. You cheer it and say yay as they make their first wobbly steps. When teachers are doing things that they're wobbly with yet, they need the support to know that we notice that their effort is being put toward that mastery. I'm seeing we're trying to build reflection into all of our lessons. That's approximate. We're doing approximations. I'm seeing that we're getting more students involved in our remote learning packets that we were hoping that all students would do. You're doing a great job of trying to get them working with us. When we can maximize the use of reinforcing language, we can maximize the self-efficacy and the belief in themselves. So let's practice what reinforcing language can look like. On the next slide, I've created 2 scenarios. On the scenarios, you can read them both, but pick one and think about what reinforcing language you would use to respond to the teacher. And again, teacher is inclusive, so it's every educator, and you're going to see that in the scenarios. You might think about how you communicate now, or how you communicate in person. Maybe if it's how you communicate now, it might be something that would be written in an email or sent in a text or through a Zoom meeting. Here are the scenarios, read them both and pick one and write down the response. It's a little harder than you think, isn't it? And finish your last thought. Here's a couple of examples that I wrote down. So for the first one, I wrote, Mr. B, I noticed that you've been inspiring students to explore new literacy with your weekly book talks. To the cafeteria staff, your extra personal touch of sending notes to parents helps strengthen our school family. So whether you send that in a text or an email, or you say that to the person in person, think about the message that Mr. B and the cafeteria staff receive. And when we go back and look at that sense of awareness of who we are, you now have highlighted that for teachers to see that they have the time to reflect on things that they can do well. So think about this question. How might reinforcing language be a valuable tool to empower educators' growth and development? As you reflect on that, think about when we think of professional development, we think about something that somebody has to read or go to or participate in. But what if the simple use of reinforcing language was one of the most important keys to growth and development? I'll tell you one thing about reinforcing language. It's the most important teacher language. It's the most powerful teacher language, and it's the most used. I'm sorry, the least used. The least used. And why? Because I think it doesn't feel natural at first. And I think we hold back. So if we think of all the things in our to-do list right now, and the things we can do to make a difference in our school, in our educators, for our students, if we could put this at the top of our to-do list, use reinforcing language today. Write an email to 3 people using reinforcing language. It's going to have amazing power. We're going to explore one more type of teacher language and another powerful one. You might say open-ended questions. I've heard of those before. Open-ended questions as an approach is absolutely not new. We probably learned about them in some type of college course somewhere along the way. First of all, I'm going to give you a general definition. Open-ended questions have no right or wrong answer. They inspire thought, they inspire reflection. And for adults, they empower adults to do the thinking around the growth that you're trying to support. So I'm going to go through these same characteristics, and I want you to think about, and you might add these to your circle map, about how open-ended questions could be a powerful tool for you to use with the educators you work with. So first of all, open-ended questions give insight into what educators already know and do. Again, you're like raising up things that they might know. For Mr. B, I might ask, after making that observation, how did you decide which books to share for your book talk? Maybe he hadn't really thought about it. And maybe he did, and I learned something about him from how he finds his best resources for education. It helps educators generate ideas or solutions. I know from colleagues that are leaders, their first weeks of doing remote learning were draining. Everybody was leaning on the principal. Everybody was coming to the principal for their concerns. That also happens in school sometimes too. What open-ended questions do is it helps empower the teachers to come up with those ideas and solutions. It empowers them. It shows our belief in them too. So for an example, an open-ended question might be, who might be a good resource for this problem? Again, it's building that collaborative culture too of who they can go to. And it might be teaching you something. You may not realize that you have this hidden technology gem on your staff, and that's who people go to for resources. It also prompts the educators to set goals by highlighting something that you notice in reinforcing language and then ask a reflecting question that can help them to think about their own goals. What might work for you in the future to prevent this problem? They now have a goal. I'm going to say something real quick before I forget. This is where silence is important too. Give people time to think after you ask an opening question. Remain engaged, not curious, but give time to think. And don't fill that space because we tend to do that. Help educators explore, experiment, and problem solve. Think how important that is. And think how valued they are when their leader asks them, what else might you try to do to connect with that hard to reach family? What might help you engage students right away in your remote class? Now I'm going to stop there for a minute because don't ask a question that you're trying to tell them something. If you really want to know what might be some ideas to help engage students right away in the remote class, ask that thought-provoking question. But don't ask them in a way to kind of test them or to come up with an answer that you're looking for. I'm going to point out there, though, that sometimes we use what's open-ended questions to say something that we're trying to say, thinking it'll land better if it's in a question. So I'm going to put this in that same characteristic. If you want to make a point without asking an open-ended question. So let's say there was a problem and the teacher said, well, just ask the principal if you have any questions. I'm not in charge of this remote learning. So I might then go to the teacher and say, so why did you tell the parents if they're unhappy about remote learning just to contact the principal? And what I want to say is, I'm happy to talk to parents and at the same time listen and be empathetic for the challenges they're having. So be careful in how we ask those open-ended questions to help them problem solve. If it's a problem you have an answer to, give them the answer. Finally, encourage educators to reflect. Adults learn more through reflection than they do through instruction. So if we give educators time to reflect, then they'll have the ability to grow with their experiences. How about this question? What about remote learning has taught you something new about yourself? I'm going to give you two more scenarios. And for these scenarios, take a minute again to write an open-ended question that you would ask, either in an email or directly to the person. And here you go. So as you read these, you might first want to write a reinforcing language statement, which you can. I think reinforcing language followed by open-ended questions helps, but we're focusing here just on open-ended questions. So the first one I came up with for Mr. or Ms. G, what about the current events you selected inspired you to build them into your lesson plans? In scenario 4, how did your team negotiate the challenges of the different schedules to come up with this solution? We're now going to move into an interactive learning structure called a swap meet. And I'm going to take you to a little bit higher level with your swap meet, and then I'm going to have you come back to these core beliefs and competencies. Before we move into our swap meet, and this is going to be a shorter share, so I'm going to have groups that are a little bit smaller. But as you get into the group, start again with alphabetical order. But I want you to think about how you can use positive teacher language to use reinforcing language or open-ended questions to support one of these social emotional competencies. For example, I might be noticing that assertiveness is a skill that I want to grow, with a staff member. And I might help that staff member by really making a point to notice when a staff member uses assertiveness appropriately, with appropriate tone and intention to meet the goal, and use it just in reinforcing language. It's going to be a one sentence share for your swap meet. But jot down right now while I prepare your breakout rooms, which competency, academic or social emotional competency, would you want to strengthen through the use of positive teacher language with one or more of the adults that you work with? And get ready to be beamed up. If you're watching this through a video, and if watching the recording of it, this is a great time to just do some planning and reflecting on how you may want to share with, how you may want to use positive reinforcing language to support the staff that you work with. Make a plan to pick one of the areas that you're focusing on. Now, it looks like we have a number of participants that aren't in the share. So let me see if I can stop share for a minute so I can see who's still here. Because for some reason, it's not letting me view anyone's face. Those people that are not in a group, this is a good time to just jot down, look at those competencies. What is a strategy that you could use? Perhaps it's to work on one of the academic competencies or one of the learning strategies. Take a moment to reflect and make a plan for jotting down your thoughts. And it looks like we have you back. So as you kind of let all that information that you just talked about and shared, all the learning that we've done about teacher language and the power that it has to work with adults, the power that we've talked about here is the same resources and the same support that we want to support teachers to use with students. As you think about this learning that you've experienced today, and actually even the format that you learned it in, this is a way we can continue to support adults in their learning about the work of responsive classroom and also the work of the power of teacher language. I mentioned before the importance and the power of taking time to reflect. And I want you to take a minute now to look at your circle map, look at the notes that you jotted down, and think about how to synthesize that information into a one sentence summary. When we take time to reflect and synthesize, it helps us to put those ideas together. You may leave this webinar today and be inspired to not do a different thing, but by taking a time to kind of close that learning through a moment of reflection, that'll help you to possibly gel this information and move ahead. So on your piece of paper, look at your notes and create one sentence that synthesizes what you've learned about, reinforcing an open-ended questions as far as teacher language, and summarize your key points. As we wrap up our webinar today, look back at the goal that you wrote early in the workshop. I guess not really workshop, early in the webinar, and reflect on that and look at the sentence that you just wrote. How is the sentence going to help you to achieve the goal that you're hoping to achieve through the webinar? One of the goals you may have is to learn more about the approaches that we talked about today. These are two excellent resources, and although the Power of Our Words for Middle School says for middle school, I found it's valuable for all educators and leaders. Similar content and just another way of helping support educators and support all of us in learning that content. On the right of your screen, you also see our responsiveclassroom.org website. This is an example of our information library. So in the space where it says search, if you go to where it says info library, you can learn more about these by searching through the many valuable articles that are available. And if you're interested in any of the workshops or conferences that we're presenting, know that in response to COVID-19, we have a number of them available right now, safely, but still true to our work in responsive classroom using a Zoom format. And social media has really become our friend in our work as we work from our homes and different places around the world. So if you're connected with us on any of these formats, great. If not, try to explore the resources there. This is that person-to-person connection, which we really appreciate. Following this webinar today, you'll hear from us. We'll get the recording for today's webinar. We also have one more webinar next week. And the topic for next week is going to be about building and strengthening adult communities. And if you're interested in any of the other work of Responsive Classroom, feel free to reach out to our school services team. Again, look at what's available on our resources. And if you haven't signed up yet for the Building and Strengthening Adult Communities, if it's something that you're interested in, I believe that's now available on our website for an area that you can sign in, or you will be getting an email that you can do that directly as well. I want to thank you from our organization, that taking this time, 90 minutes of your time, is so valuable, and I appreciate you spending this time with me, and I enjoy the chance that you got to connect with other leaders. I will stay on. I'm going to stop share with this right now. Anybody that just wants to stay on for 10 more minutes, I'll just have a back and forth Q&A if you have any questions. And for those of you that are leaving us, go on and have a great rest of your day, and hope to maybe see you next week.